Hi there and welcome to Weekends Web App. Today is day 28 and today is the day where we start to dive into React. If you want to follow along at home, you want to pull the repository from github.com/weareoffcider/weekendswebapp. You can use the clone command here and clone it using git. And then once you bring it down, if you want to start off with today's code, you'll want to use the command git checkout day 26, as that's where we finished off last time. My apologies, day 27. So today being day 28, we're going to be diving into React. If we look at where we finished off last time, we had ourselves, let me just start up the server, and in addition to that, we'll also start up our component server. So with those two things put together, if we jump into the browser, take a look. We've got ourselves a very simple component, a HTML component, and like that's nice. It's all gives us something to work with, right? But it's very primitive, right? And it's not going to be enough for us to build a fully all-singing, all-dancing application out of. We would have to have some level of complexity here. And there is a way people have figured out to build these large, expansive, component-rich web applications. And one of the most popular ones these days is this concept of virtual DOM. And that was popularized by React as a framework. If we just take a quick look at React.js's homepage. So as you can see, a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. It's quite a humble definition, but that's really all it does. And it just provides it's a really good tool for building out the DOM. So anyway, getting back to the method it popularized. It's this concept of virtual DOM. So if I grab my drawing board, bring the smoothing down. What are we on? Day 28. So this concept of virtual DOM, if you listen to talks about React, this stems from an observation about how some video game rendering works as well, depending on the engine. Essentially, we've got this part of rendering an application which can be quite slow. So you have the page and it'll look like this, say, and then you want to change it to something else. So you issue a bunch of commands to the DOM, and then I'll just keep it yellow. And then we have state 2. And the issue is that this part here is pretty slow, right? And if you're doing it manually, doing it inefficiently, it can take an awful long time, and it can also get quite complex. But React's concept, this virtual DOM concept, was the idea that maybe instead of doing operations directly to the DOM, what you do is you create a virtual representation. So a virtual representation of the DOM. And like the DOM, for people who maybe forget, it's document object model. It's all the things that make up any sort of web page. So if we jump in, this is the DOM. These are why can't I resize that? Let me resize. Here we go. So all of these are parts of the DOM, as it were. Now, getting back to here. So that virtual DOM has instructions for the way the document is meant to look. And the first time it happens, it just publishes exactly what it is. So this is like they probably use inner HTML or something like this. They publish to the component that they need, or publish is a wrong word, but like they render out to the HTML. Now, the second time, there might be some new information. So usually this will be fed by data in. And if you can think about data, it's just like this data here. Just here, right? So at frame 2, we'll call this. At frame 2, our data changes, and we have a new representation. And we'll make it look completely different, just for giggles. And the thing is all of this happens in JavaScript and is actually quite fast, because if you were to, like when you interact with the DOM, there's a whole lot of things that kick off whenever you interact with the DOM, like CSS changes, like there's painting, there's rendering, there's calculations that take place. And none of that happens if you just do the calculation of the DOM in a virtual representation. And all that means is that all they mean by the words virtual DOM is that they don't actually play with the real DOM, but rather just a tree structure that they control, like they've coded it purely in JavaScript, right? And the thing is by having a comparison, knowing what the difference is between these two, they can make a diff, or a difference between those two. They can figure out what changed from this point to this point. And in knowing so, they can interpret that to become the most efficient instructions to get from this state to this state, to frame 2, so that things look like this. And sometimes that might just be an inner HTML, but it also, if there's only small things that need to change, it might be a number of class changes, or it might be moving a particular item, so moves of particular items, text content changes. But either way, the whole idea of the system is that it can efficiently change from one frame to the next. And that, I mean, like that in itself is a useful goal. The other is that at any particular time, because of this concept of data comes in and tells you exactly what the whole application looks like, essentially you can re-render a massive application without too much drama. Because you have data in, like we've been doing, and then you have this idea of sort of a top level, that was a terrible straight line there. Hardly call that one a straight line. Anyway, so say we have a line here, just down properly so I can draw on it. And then with, so you've got some sort of maybe app component, and then inside of it, maybe you've got like nav, and maybe you've got a page. And inside of it, you've got, say, buttons. All of these components need to come together, just like with our CSS that we were discussing. And the thing about React is it makes it fairly easy, or really any framework that allows you to build components out in this way. It makes it quite easy to build all these different things and simply pass down the necessary data. So the app will pass down the necessary data to these, and then maybe some data into there, and maybe some data into the button, and so on and so forth. You get all these different places where the data can flow to, and all of that, whenever a change happens, it happens in the JavaScript first, and then a small diff will take care of the actual changes between one to the other. Now, once you get to an app that's of a certain size, this can become quite complex and actually slow things down. But then there's ways that you can that you can optimize that after that. Now, there are other things that are good about this setup, because this works on the server, on the client. Oops, that was terrible spelling. It's fast by default, or like common practice is fast. When you start optimizing React, generally that's because you've got something that's particularly performance sensitive, and that's a really important thing. You want to be able to write things. You don't want to have to spend hours and hours on every single little thing to make every single little thing fast. It's good if things are fast as a general default, and then there are options for you to optimize down the track as well. And React gives us both those things. It's generally very fast, and it has a much better space for making things even faster down the track. So as a standard framework for doing doing development, it's been quite good for me anyway. And I've been using it since it was open sourced essentially. Now, you'll notice that we haven't touched on React at all when we started this, and the reason why is because as much as I love React as a tool, I do not wish to fully bind myself to it. So if we ever want to build new components in some new fandangled thing that comes out, we can. All right, we might not have to, we might never need to, but we can. And that's just in terms of like us making certain choices that mean we're not entirely wedded to React in every single way of the word. Anyway, there's probably enough talking about the concept of React and why it's useful. What we'll do is we'll start to build out some components that are in React, so that we can sort of get a feel for how it is that you're meant to use React. So React is a library that we'll need to bring in. So let's do just that. I'll bring this into another page. So we want to add React. We want to add React DOM. We want to add React DOM factories, I think. Let me double check that one actually. They've they updated a few things when they started up. So anyway, I'm just looking through the documentation. Another good thing about React is its documentation is extremely well written, and if you want more information or background on React, I highly recommend you take a look at it, because they do a great job of explaining what React is about, especially in the first steps of it. But either way, we're just going to start by adding React in. These are all no good. I just want to see the npm version of things. Yeah. None of that's useful to me. I want to install it with Node. Never mind. All right. Let's bring it in with Yarn. Okay, so we want React DOM, and we want React DOM factories. All right. I think we actually need to bring the types in as well, so we'll bring them in as development dependencies. So types, and types. I'll just touch up the screen size, font size just a little bit. Good stuff. Okay, so from here, we don't want to worry about injecting this into our application just yet. It would be better to set up our component server so that we can do some component development using React. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to restart Gulp real quick. And then we're going to dive into the config for the component. That is coming from Gulp, and I might just turn that off real quick. That's from the Webpack bundle analyzer. I'm just going to turn that off just for now, because I don't really need that bundle analyzer currently, and I'll probably make that optional soon. All right, back to what we were doing. So we need to create ourselves a new sort of aspect to this component layer, which is now going to look into sort of very particular components. So what we can do is we can, what I'll do is I'll start making a component, and like a very basic one, and then we'll go from there. So if we jump into, just gonna jump around into UI, and we've got this UI button component here. And what I might do is I'll put a React component right next to it so we can demonstrate the same concept using React, and then we'll expand from there. That's what we'll do. Okay, so if we take button.html.ts, we've got this very simple, straightforward component. What we're going to do is we're going to create a functional component, I guess, yeah, functional component, which uses client UI / Atom / button, and instead of being button.html.ts, it's going to be button.react.tsx. So we're essentially naming it by the type of technology we use. And in addition to that, we're putting things together so that we can we're putting things together so that we can pick out those particular files and put them into our component server without too much trouble. Now in this case, we need to grab DOM from React from React, and then we also need to grab DOM from React DOM factories. These are sort of things that are just like very specific and required for React. Now, one other thing we also need from here is we need some sort of component, and it can be as simple as a function, just like this one, or it can be more complex. It can be a component class, but we'll start off with just a function, right? So we'll start off with this default function, and we'll take data, which will be any for now, but we will eventually build up from there. And this first version is going to look an awful lot like HTML, with a few differences, which you'll see as we get a bit further through. And you can already see the first one. But let's keep going. So we've got this class name, button, and then we've got data.title and button here. Alright, so I'm not actually providing the JSX flag either, which I do need to do, so I need to upgrade my TypeScript to cover that. And just so I don't get too lost, I'm gonna just have another project on the side here, just to make sure I get all my settings right. Okay, so we need to support a thing called JSX, which is yeah, I guess a portmanteau of JavaScript XML. And what it allows you to do is sort of put HTML inside your JavaScript. It's something that's needed to make things play well with with your TypeScript, with your JavaScript. And let me just carry this on a little bit further, and I'll explain it a bit clearer. Okay, so this is, it looks a lot like this, except we've got this these button classes, and this this JSX, or this TSX in terms of TypeScript, allows you to sort of write HTML into here, and what ends up happening is it turns into something that can be used by React to render out your page in a particular way. It builds out that virtual DOM looking structure, and we'll come back to that because it's helpful to see what that actually turns into, but we'll come back to that first. For now, what we're going to do is we're actually just going to try and get this thing rendering first. So we got to jump into our config and start to build out something using React instead. So what we're going to do is create ourselves React components and match it for React components, and this time it's going to match against anything that's react.tsx. Okay, so now we've got potentially an option of the data coming from a TSX file or a TS file. So I'm going to actually change this so that it can match either. And what do I need to change here? Oh yeah. So yeah, I could probably do this a different way, but anyway, I'll just This is kind of slack. I could probably iterate over it, but I don't really feel like doing that just right now. So instead, I'm just going to be a little bit lazy. And instead just test this one and then test that one. And in fact, they're named wrong. There we go. So now I can have my data file be either a TX file or a TSX file. Okay. So in this case, the render is a little bit different. See, if I try to, like I'll probably see that come up here. I can see that there, but it's already going to fail because it doesn't know what to do with this file here. Because yeah, we don't have an appropriate loader to handle this type of file. So we need to fix that particular problem. So the first problem, I believe, is that we're not loading off TSX. We're not loading TSX files properly. So I need to look into that. And that probably has something to do with the fact that I haven't actually reloaded Gulp yet. Yeah, you can see there, cannot use JSX unless the JSX flag is provided. So if we fix that now, okay, so now we're back in, but now it's not rendering quite correctly yet. And that's because this is not how you render with a React component. You actually need to put it through something. You need to put it through a library. So in that case, we're gonna go grab those libraries that we need. So we're gonna do the requirement inside here so that we don't do it, we don't pull it for the client. And the first one we're gonna go is we're gonna grab React. And grab React there. And then we need a React DOM. In fact, we might not need React, in fact, but anyway. So rendering with React requires this little react.dom. So if we were to go react DOM and then do render, we need to give it some sort of a component or something like that and then tell it what to look like, right? And this will give you an insight as to what it actually looks like in when you strip away all of the JavaScript, sorry, the XML looking stuff. So if we were going to render this component, what we would instead of just calling it as a function, we use this react.createElement function and then go component module.default, which is the default function. Default element to it, and then we give it all its data as its second argument. And by doing that, we have something that's going to do something. But first, what we need to do? Oh my, I'm getting confused. Never mind me. Let's reset here. Let's reset. React as a concept allows you to render certain things, okay? But before you do that, you need to create elements. So that's what this instruction is right here, this react.createElement. After you've done that, however, you need to take that element and you either, when you're in the client, you push it onto a particular DOM element and it gets rendered. Or you need to render it into a string, which is what you would do if you're on the server, right? So first things first, we'll talk about the server. So on the server side, so we'd pull down react-dom/server. And then here, we're going to render to string. Not render to static markup, because render to static markup means that you can't attach to it down the track, but render to string. So what we're going to do here is we're going to render to string. So react-dom.render to string using the elem, or the element, as it were. And if we do that, we should be able to get these buttons rendering. You can see that right there, okay? And if we poke into it, you can see it's got that button green, and then it's got this data React root, which is really just a declaration that, hey, I am the baseline of where the React started, right? Now, the alternative to that, if we were to just put an empty string in there, just to sort of make the point, the alternative to that is we could just do that. And now let's instead have our client do the rendering. So here we're not going to use this client path or this test code for now. And instead, we're going to aim to take this component module and render it in place. We've got this container that we can use to put it into, and that's what we're going to do with the React DOM version. So you can see here this React DOM server versus the React DOM, and here we're going to create an element, and instead of rendering it, we'll get rid of that return, we'll return null actually. So we're going to take this element and we're going to again work with it, but this time we're going to take React DOM, and we have a different API for this one. So here we've got render, hydrate, which is a way of connecting server rendered code to client rendered code. We're not going to worry about that just now. We've got this render process where we can render a particular element, so that element that we created, and we render it into some sort of container. So in this case, we want to render it into the container that we've chosen here. So now we've got it rendering, and this is being rendered by React. So you can see here we've got the HTML.ts, which has that actual thing happening with client and whatnot. And then we've got the React component here. Now, not that impressive, I'm sure, but at this point, maybe it's time to investigate the other things that we can do with React components. So if we look at button.react.tsx, we've got this concept of where we're feeding it some data, but what React refers to is called properties. Okay, so rather than using the word properties, let's call it what it is, props. Okay, and furthermore, we could probably take a moment to define the interface to these props. So the interface to these button props equals modifier, which is a string, and maybe we say it's optional, maybe not, and data, which is title, which is also a string. And now we've got a very clear sort of intent for this this function, and it can be used to be like we can. It's got a very clear API. We know how we're meant to use it, and that's the properties. Those are the things coming from the outside. But what if this thing, whatever it is, needs to keep track of some internal state? Well, it has that concept too. But in order to do that, we need to turn this into a class. And that's what we're going to take a moment to do now. So, as a simple function, it's all very well and good. But let's say we want to have it as a class. We would change this function to be a render class, and then a render function. And then instead, we'd export a default class. We'll call it button, and we'll extend from React dot. So we have component, we have pure component. For the moment, we're going to use pure component, and I'll explain why that is down the track. But we'll leave that for the moment. Okay, so now we have this concept of a component, and we can also give it some state, and we can use generic types to give us some sort of behavior here. Let's think about some internal state. Let's give it a counter, right? So we'll have a button state, and we'll have a count, which is a number. So now we could add that here. So now we have a component that has button props as its properties that it's expecting, and button state. Now this won't work so well right now, or rather TypeScript's not kicking in at the moment because I hadn't saved it for a while, but let's close this and we'll bring it back open just to hopefully demonstrate the point. Yeah, TypeScript is still dying for some reason, but at any rate, I can definitely tell you that this data is not going to work. Instead, what we would want that to be is this dot props and this dot props for the title. And in fact, you can see there it's already figured it out, right? It can see modifier and title. So there are parts of my my coding environment that are picking that up, right? And then we also have this dot state, which will have count attached to it. And the thing about count or state is there is a very explicit way in which they pass through so that, you know, things don't happen by magic. So if we were to set the state up for this, if we were to set up the state for this component, what we would need to do is first set up the constructor and call super, which essentially just does all the things that this class would normally do. And then we initialize the state in here. So let's just say we give it a state, a count of 5, just by default, right? Oops. Notice that if I had added something else, it would have complained about it because I'm not allowed to do that, right? Now, let's put that count just after here. So we'll go put in this .state.count. Chuck that in there, right? And we'll just have a look at what things look like over here. So you can see our number there. Okay, after a small space because I left that space in there. All very well and good, we've got that state, but maybe we want it to change. So at this point, we talk about what it is to create a component. It's not just properties and state. It's also allowing you to bind on event listeners or bind on reactions to particular actions within the system. So, for example, we could potentially allow something to happen when we click on here. Hang on. It's not so great. Let's change there. Yeah. So say we had a function, right? So on button click, we made a function here. And the E will be an event. So how about we prevent default and instead we want to change the state. We can't just do this.state.count equals 6 because that doesn't actually trigger things to change. What we need to instead use is a thing in the API, and it is well documented. So it's on react.component is set state. Where is it? So yeah, the set state enqueues changes to the component state and tells React that this component and its children need to be re-rendered. So that's the point. It has a very explicit way of telling everything that it needs to be re-rendered. So let's say that we increment it up by, I don't know, let's double it just for fun. All right, so this .state.count times 2. Okay, and we will also need to have on button click here. Now this on its own won't quite work. Mouse events. Alright, maybe I need to fix this. HTML button element. Mouse event or void. E and event are incompatible. Okay, so I need to HTML button element. Is that going to do it? Mouse event is not generic. I need react.mouse event maybe. There we go. Yeah, react.mouse event. Lovely. Okay, now we've got our types sorted. Now this isn't quite going to work. I'll just demonstrate why real quick. So if I click on it, it's gonna have a console error because this is undefined. And that's just because you have to do what's called bind each of these methods to make sure that they stay attached to the class. And we can do this here. We will figure out a better way to do it real soon. So this on button click equals this dot on button click dot bind this. That's just essentially a way to make this function be a self-contained unit that always remembers where it came from. And you pretty much always need to do that with React. So now, when we click on this button, it upgrades the state. And you can see these are isolated from one another. So they don't have anything to do with one another in terms of this state. Very useful, yeah? And there is eventually some useful dev tools that we can attach to it as well. So let me see if Firefox has React dev tools. I'm pretty sure it does. Alright, let's add that. Cool. Alright, so we've got our React dev tools. Yeah, and now we can jump into React here. And you can see those components. And you can start to see all of the different things that are going on. You can see it as a state change. It's probably a bit small, but trust me, that state is changing. And let me see if I can, yeah, I can make it bigger. There we go. So you can see the counter over here, and you can even start to delve into components and see the virtual DOM that's being created out of it. You can see these spaces and then this number. And you can see how that stuff changes. You can see the various bits and pieces. And you can even edit them yourself and see how things change throughout the system. So this concept of props and state is extremely versatile, very powerful. You can do a lot with it. And what's even better is, in the end of the day, this is still just the DOM, right? So if you had some sort of particular drag and drop thing happening, you could still, by using, now we'd have to pull out React DOM to do it. We'd have to pull out React DOM to do it, but we can actually get the node, right? So we could get React DOM.find DOM node this. And if we do that, every time we click on it, oh, did it? Oh wait, I didn't console log it. So every time we click, you can see here we've got these buttons, they come on out for us. Very useful, right? And like that way we could potentially do some sort of animation on it. We could break the rules of React for a little while and do our own animation, do something super fast. But we have that escape hatch, we have that flexibility. But when we're not using that escape hatch, we've got this fairly strong model that allows us to build out fairly complicated UI using this JSX language. Now, while it does potentially makes it look a little more complicated to do so, I think it's worthwhile to see what it is exactly that this looks like under the hood. Because the JSX is just sugar. It's something to help you write your code if you don't want to, so that it looks more like the HTML that's going to come out on the other side. It's actually under the hood. It uses a lot of React.create element. So I'm going to rewrite this code using just straight old HTML, or straight old JavaScript rather. So here you can see we've got the properties, and instead we're just delivering them as an object. So you have either a component, like our button component, or you've got a string, which means it's just going to be a HTML element. Or you can use these React DOM factories up here, but I'm not going to do that just right now. So we're using React.create element. We're doing onClick, then class name. So we've got those properties, and then we've got the children. So the children would be this first string. There's this gap here that actually needs to be rendered, so we need a little string there. And then this .state.count. And then that is our component. Let's see if it works. Okay, you can see it didn't crash that time. So that is the alternative to using JSX. Now, I mean, some would argue that it's actually kind of nicer in some cases, but you end up with a lot of React.create elements in your code, and it starts to take up a lot of space, and it's not always the best reading for designers who are used to HTML. So that is the reason why we sort of stick in this land of using JSX. So this is a real simple component using React as a concept. Now the benefit of this is this does grow quite well. Once you start to get bigger and bigger applications, as I was talking about before, you can start from the small components, you can start from the big components, work your way in. But either way, you're defining these APIs and working your way down to final pages, final and full structures. So React as a library gives you, like, it provides a very powerful way to sort of express all these structures while still having a pretty quick experience. Now, there's a few things that we sort of want to make a bit better. I don't much like having to do this on button click. Once you get a really long component, like you can imagine if we had 5 different methods all the way down, obviously I'm exaggerating here, and you have to go back up to bind them every single time, it kind of gets a bit old, really. So what I like to do is instead use a concept of decorators, which is method decorators, which is kind of nice. So there's a library out there. I mean, I was thinking of doing it internally, but I don't think we'll necessarily learn much by doing it internally. So I'm just gonna grab a bind decorator first up. So by adding this bind decorator, what it's going to allow me to do is, instead of having to do this line, I'm instead just going to be able to decorate what's called decorating this method. And at the moment I don't have decorator support enabled for tsconfig, just because it's a little closer to the bleeding edge. But we can fix that. We can put ourselves experimental decorator support on in our TypeScript options. And if we have to change it down the track, it's not really much skin off my nose. So there we go. Experimental modules, experimental decorators rather. So we've got to refresh this, refresh gulp, and yep, we're good to go on there now. So now using that bind decorator, what that gives us is that same bind functionality, but we don't have to keep on crawling back up and down. So if we said that if we said on mouse over, and then we went on mouse enter or something like that, this dot on mouse over, you can see all that works because we've got this bind right here. So now we've got something else. If we put the mouse over, we also get incrementing happening, yeah? So that's more behaviors. We're starting to put together more things with these components. So, and you can see here TypeScript coming to our rescue, letting us know that we've broken things. In fact, I might keep those just for now, just to prove the point, because obviously we're not going to run into a fully fledged application looking like this. Okay, so we have our component library now set up with React components. Whoop-de-doo. While we're at it, we should probably make this component server a little more efficient. One thing that's a bit of a problem is the way I've got it set up right now, it just grabs everything. And the moment we start putting in lots of CSS and images and all that sort of thing, all of that's going to end up in our Webpack tree. Not a lot of fun. So what we want to do instead of that is we want to restrict that context to very particular files. So I'm just going to, again, grab this from another old place. And we're just going to add a third argument, which is a regex for the types of files that it's allowed to pick up. So only JavaScript, TypeScript, and TypeScript X or TSX files should be picked up. And if we do that, our component server file shouldn't grow to unimaginable dimensions. And what we can also do is we can fix up that there. So here we've got this, so now we're returning React DOM. So now it's rendering just like that. It's going to complain, however. You can see here we're using render on server rendered markup. So instead what we want to do is make it hydrate, and we'll do that just here. And that's just like React will do certain things a little more efficiently if it works in a certain way. That's pretty much the difference. And we can probably return at that statement instead. And we are good. So we've got ourselves some components that are working now. We will spend some more time sort of setting up our React system, as it were. But that sort of provides, I guess, a little bit of an introduction. I know it's not enough, but keep in mind we will be working with React constantly while we build this application. Nearly every component will be made out of React, made out of the React in the foreseeable future. So we'll have a lot of time to get comfy with React. So what I want to do is spend the last 15 minutes of this stream just sort of going back over some concepts of React. So the first thing is React is a virtual DOM representation, and that virtual DOM is represented by this stuff, right? Like you render, you create functions, or you create classes that return a structure that shows what the HTML is going to look like, and that handles your virtual DOM here. And then when things change, it calculates that difference and does it as efficiently as possible. So here, if you look at these changes that are happening, it knows that the only thing it has to change is the text. It just knows that. And that's very important because it means it can do it in the most efficient way possible. So that's the broad strokes of how it's meant to come together. React is primarily made up of components, and components can be either classes like this, or they can be functions. So a function accepts some sort of properties, and we'll just put any as the type on it, and it will return some sort of DOM structure, right? So let's say we wanted to put a little span in there that had some text, like we'll just put in I am a functional component. And we'll return that, okay? So it doesn't do anything with some props and all that, it's just, that's the component, right? So that is a legit component that we could actually use inside this code here. And let's do just that. After the title and the count, we'll put that in here. So we'll go some functional component. Notice how it looks just like calling a HTML element, except it's based on that name there. So we can put that component in there, and that will render. You can see them right there. What if we wanted to also have the count attached to it? Well, we can do just that as well. We'll change this to a template literal. And we'll put in props.count based off the props object just there, right? Well, we haven't actually passed that prop down. So if we have a look here, you can see how it's just showing up as undefined. But we can pass that down the line if we were to do something like count this dot state dot count. Okay, so you see properties are passed down in this world of JSX. Properties are passed down just like you would HTML attributes. And there's a few that named a bit different. You'll know that on HTML, class is just class, but because class is a reserved word within JavaScript, they chose not to do that and instead do class name, which matches with its JavaScript the way JavaScript would refer to class names within in the DOM API. There's a few other exceptions for that as well, like HTML4. So instead of like there's a for HTML attribute, but you use HTML4 in React. But yes, this allows us to pass through properties and come down to these functional components. And if you can choose, if you have a choice, you use functional components always ahead of you use functional components ahead of these standard these full components here. What am I trying to say? You use functional components ahead of class components, and that's just because functional components are more efficient. That said, though, often you do end up in a world where you need to create class components, because if you want to create any activity, interactivity, or any state, bind any methods like these, you sort of need to not use functions, right? So there's this functional component. There's the absolute simplest. A class component. The main difference is that, well, it's a class. The function is moved into a render function. You can see here. And if you want to access the props, you have to use this.props. And if you want to access the state, you use this.state. But otherwise, that function, like that component, gets used in much the same way. Like if we were to say, create some recursive place here where we wanted to get this button component, notice same as the button up there, and say we give it no name, right? Like, so if we do something weird, right? Like say, only if this.props.title should I then create a button inside that has a blank title. Very weird usage, right? We'll make the title and the modifier optional, and maybe this will work. And if we do that, we'll end up with a button inside a button. And even weirder, you can see how things get contained within one another, because buttons within buttons are not a thing that HTML is a fan of. But either way, you can see here how I'm calling that same button there, but only once. So you can create class components just like you would functional components by using this syntax. But under hood, keep in mind that they always use react.createElement. So it's react.createElement.button, and then the properties or the data or whatever. Okay. So this allows us to build out functions and classes that define our interface. And the key thing this is going to give us is that isolation we so crave, that ability to say, all right, this particular thing is responsible for only these particular things, and allow us to really dive down and have all these test cases that exercise that particular component, make sure it all works hunky-dory, and then we can go on to the next thing, and then the next thing. And then when it comes time to actually employ this all in the application, it works as we expect it to, rather than having lots of edge cases that we're not aware of. So that sort of brings us to what React is for, right? So that whole concept of pulling things together in various ways, pulling our user interface together into various isolated components. As I said, it's a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. And there's a bunch of cool little examples here. You can see most of these use class components to demonstrate what they're about. So you got this hello, this.props.name, and then this usage here, and then a stateful component with this timer, and then you've got this little application here, this little to-do app, again built over a very small amount of space. So that's going to serve as our foundation for the application that we're going to build. And honestly, it's getting to the point where it's high time we talked about that application. So I think It's a shame it didn't happen on day 30. It'll happen on day 29. It's just the way it is. So I think tomorrow, what we're going to do is we're going to launch into the application for real. So I'll share the actual document that sort of forms as the basis for what we're going to build. We don't have a massive plan in place, but I do know what I'm planning on building. So that'll give us sort of something to anchor off all the various concepts that we need to pull together. And yeah, that'll serve as a baseline so that we can start putting this application together for real. Now, there's definitely going to be certain things that we cross over with and have to deal with in the early stages of putting this application together, such as how do we pass our localization context to React, what's the right way for everything to work and all that sort of thing. But I'm sort of happy to sort of address those as we come up to them, and I'm just mindful of keeping in the weeds too much. So yeah, I think that pretty much does it for talking about React for today. As I said, we will be covering over a lot of React once we start getting into actually building this thing. So it won't really help us to get too enamored with what's going on in React components until we talk about what we're actually building. Okay, I think that just about does it for me. I feel like I've got a cold coming on, so it's probably a time for a good night's sleep tonight. All right. So what did we do today? Well, it was day 28. Introduction to React. Building a small button component using React component server. That's pretty much it. Now, there will actually need to be a bunch of other stuff that we'll have to do once we get into actual development proper, such as setting up a proper template for our component building and whatnot. But yeah, as I said, I think we'll all in due time and as it's required. So we want to add a tag for day 28 as well, and we want to push that, and then we want to push tags. All right, that'll pretty much do it. If you want to follow along at home, you'll find all of this code living at github.com/weareoffsider/weekendswebapp. You can see there, day 28's just arrived. And we'll be back tomorrow night, probably around 8 o'clock, where we'll pick up with the application for real. Thanks for watching.